In May of 2018, our ERS signed on to something called the Principles of Responsible Investment. And that sign-on offers 3 commitments by our ERS. Our ERS is supposed to incorporate ESG issues, that means environmental, social, and governance issues, into investment analysis and decision-making processes, ownership policies, and practices. The ERS is also supposed to seek appropriate disclosure on ESG issues by entities in which they invest. And then they're also supposed to report on their activities back to the legislature about implementing those ESG principles. Today, we're going to be joined by Ian Chan Hodges, Imogen Rose Smith, Delilah Rothenberg, and Jason Ward. We'll be discussing how public pension plans invest their money, particularly when it comes to private equity, the impact of private equity business model on workers and the economy, and private equity and tax avoidance. Some alternative models for private equity capital investment. We'll leave time at the end for dialogue and some case studies for discussion. First, I'd like to introduce Imogen Rose Smith. She's a co-organizer for the Maui ESG Project and the Ahupua'a Investment Summit, which was held here on Maui in January, just before COVID. Imogen has 15 years experience covering institutional asset management as a senior writer for Institutional Investor magazine. She was a 2017 to 2019 fellow at the University of California Regents, where she worked on ESG and sustainability issues. Her expertise include institutional investors, hedge funds, venture capital, impact investing, government policy, and long-term asset ownership. Imogen, can you provide an overview on how pension funds work and primarily how they make investment decisions, please?
Thank you, Representative Wildberger. I can try. I think you've already given a very good introduction. Again, what we're really talking about here is defined benefit pension plans. And they are basically what they say on the tin. If you have a defined benefit pension, that means that when you're fully vested, you get a defined benefit, meaning that you are guaranteed a certain retirement payment in perpetuity, depending on what is negotiated in the union contract. So every state pension has a defined benefit pension plan, and a lot of municipalities do too. Obviously, in Hawaii, you have ERS, it's a $17 billion plan. And so pension plans have a pool of capital that they then pay out to beneficiaries. And that money comes from workers. It's money that's taken out of your wages. It comes from your employer. So your employer might be the state or it might be the county. And then it also comes from taxpayer dollars. So most public pension plans in the US are not fully funded, which meaning they don't have enough money to pay out all of the pension benefits that are needed. So I think ERS I looked it up the other day, but that might be a few years old now. It's somewhere in it's like 54% funded, which means, were the pensions to be frozen tomorrow, it would only have 54% roughly of the funds that it needs to pay out pension beneficiaries. That's not necessarily a concern today because the pension isn't going to be turned off tomorrow, but it can become so somewhere like Puerto Rico, they have what is now called a pay-as-you-go system. They have no money in the system and they just have to pay out as they go along. The ways in which you can make that funding gap up is either through paying more into the system and or investment returns. And so that puts a huge amount of pressure on investment returns in order to help make that funding gap up and certainly not lose money. So the pool of capital that goes into the pension is then invested in various ways. Historically, those investments, back in the day, originally, those investments were probably just purely treasury assets. But more recently, sort of in the 80s, 90s, and many funds into the early 2000s, it would be a mixture of stocks and bonds. So it would be 60% equities, 40% bonds. And that's because, you know, bonds are considered low risk and equities is higher risk. And so that's how you got your returns. What started to happen after basically the sort of dot-com crash in 2001, which I'm dating myself now. So in the dot-com crash of 2001, there was this realization, oh, we're overly allocated to what at the time was tech stocks. And so there was this realization on the part of institutional investors, including defined benefit pension plans, that they needed to what is called diversify into other types of asset classes. So those could be things like real estate, hedge funds, and in particular, private equity. So what you've seen happen again, sort of all across the country, is this shift away from a traditional stocks and bonds allocation to this increase in what is called alternative investments. And private equity has become a particularly popular alternative investment for people to invest in large part because it has had amongst the most attractive returns. And we're going to talk in a little bit as to why that is. So you've seen more and more money flow into alternative investments, more and more money flow into private equity. And what you've also seen is you've seen this money go to the largest private equity fund managers. So we're going to talk a little bit about Apollo and Blackstone, and those are amongst the largest, best known private equity managers in the world. So why is it that capital flows to these managers? In part, it's because they've historically had good to medium returns, but it's also because of their size. So, you know, if your ERS is only 17 billion, but, you know, CalPERS, CalSTARS, a lot of the large public pension plans are ginormous. And it's hard for them to write checks for, say, you know, $50 million. And they have an asset allocation, which is what this is, that tells them they have to have X percentage of their money invested in private equity. So they're constantly having to allocate more and more money to private equity. They don't want to they don't want to go with small managers because they don't want to be the biggest investor there. So the inclination is to keep giving money to these large private equity managers in order to fill their asset allocation demands, which they need to do in order to have the risk-adjusted returns that they need in order to continue to have the pool of capital needed to pay pension benefits. But you know, investing in particular in something like private equity has real life consequences, right? You're investing in something and that is out in the world. So what you're seeing, for example, in Maui, is that a lot of these private equity managers who now have these big private equity funds that they're going out to invest are looking around trying to buy up assets to invest in. And again, because they have these big, you know, multi-billion-dollar funds, they need the things that they invest in to be large. So something like, you know, a hotel on Maui is a large investment that makes sense if you have a multi-billion-dollar private equity fund. So, you know, and when they make those investments, they're trying to get the best return they can for their assets. So that might mean, for example, they're trying to do it in ways that are most advantageous from a tax perspective. They might, for example, be trying to invest in ways where they're not using organized labor because they know that they can lower their employment budget if they do it that way. So it has an investment like that can have mixed impacts on the community that it's invested in this case, Maui, right? So obviously, if you know, Blackstone comes in and buys the Grand Wailea, that has certain benefits, right? So it's paying taxes, it's hiring people. Those investments, so ERS is invested in the Blackstone fund that is an investor in Grand Wailea. That investment, assuming it goes well, is going to have a direct benefit for the pension beneficiaries. But there are also potentially negative ramifications that we're going to talk about in a little bit. Was that a helpful sum? Was that clear? Do you have questions?
Yeah, that's great. It's great to understand how pension funds started out with their investing, but have evolved into a much different model of investing that includes big investment monsters that we don't know as much about. Thank you so much.